Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the Backlog Battle Podcast. This is Alex, and in case this is the first time you've ever listened or watched a show, we talk to gamers from all walks of life in the hopes of understanding and building empathy within our larger gaming community as a whole. For the past few months, I've gotten to know so much awesome content creators that it's kind of really amazing because every single time we have a chat, we always wind up wanting to do a part two because we're talking so much and there's such interesting people. And today we have a very, very special guest because I've loved her content even way before she started making YouTube videos, because I remember her leaving a comment on one of my videos and I was so curious about her. I started following her on social media, on YouTube, and she has now more subscribers than I do. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Britta, also known as Food4Dogs. How are you doing?
Hey everyone, I'm fine. Thank you, Alex, and thank you for inviting me. It's going to be great.
It is going to be great. I remember one of the reasons why you're here, apart from me being such a huge fan of your work, is the Kiseki nut, Dominic. Him and I actually talked about you on the show for quite a brief moment because we were talking about how long we're going to be like in the YouTube space. And here you are, really, I think, in my opinion, you're like a trailblazer for a lot of gamers out there. And the reason why I say that is because, not to be caught up in some of the minutia of gaming community drama, but there's been a lot of people lately who've been chastised for being adults and gaming still. And that to me is a big surprise because I'm 42 years old, and I'm still gaming. And I will refrain from asking for your age because I don't know how much of a subject matter that is.
I have never made a secret of my age. I'm very, very fast approaching the figure 70. Okay. It's looming on the horizon. Yeah. So I'm just 1 year off that. Yeah. Mm.
Okay. Yes. Well, that's such a milestone. And this is all to say that we're all an admirer of your work and what you're doing for the community and how much positivity you're infusing in this community.
Mm. It's a really, really interesting topic and one that completely surprised me when I started doing regular videos on my channel, because I started out like most people, just with a few small video clips I just wanted to share with friends. I never had any intention of starting a channel as such. Mm-hmm. But once I had more people coming in, this has been a regular recurring comment I get from so many people. And the interesting thing is they are from all age groups. And they're saying, I've been told to stop gaming because that's for kids. And you're an adult now. You should be ashamed of yourself, you know. Mm-hmm. And I've had people almost, in tears in the comments saying, it's just so refreshing to see someone my age who's enthusiastic about gaming, and I don't feel ashamed about it at all. It never occurred to me. It's a hobby. It's a glorious hobby, like many other hobbies. And I was really bowled over by the response. How many gamers had experienced such negative response to the simple fact that they enjoy playing video games. Mm-hmm. And to me, that only reflects that out there must be huge numbers of people who simply have no clear idea what a game is and what playing a game means. They probably have some strange notion, either that it's just something like for little kids, like you get maybe on your smartphone where you just sort of swipe and tap a little bit, or they might think you just sit there with one of these guns and keep sort of shooting away. And they say, well, that's rubbish and that's a waste of time. There's no broader conception out there about the huge range of games and the intellectual stimulation they can provide. And that was, I have to be honest here, that was one reason why I started looking into games, because I thought, well, I'm getting on now. I need to keep the old grey cells working. And while I've always done a lot of things and a lot of reading and watching movies and documentaries and all that stuff, I thought I need something even more active where I have to really use my brain. And I found that video games are really challenging. And that is just what I wanted. And I think it's excellent. I'm hoping my grey cells will keep working for many years to come.
That's a very eloquent answer. And it actually makes me curious then, is your fandom of video games recent, or is this something that you've experienced throughout your life?
No, I mean, if you do a quick calculation, think about my age and then work backwards, I grew up as a child in the 1950s, and I've actually done a series of videos called Tech of My Childhood. And I did them just as a sort of a little personal project, more just for myself and a few friends. And I was really surprised that they proved reasonably popular on my channel. A lot of people really, really enjoyed that trip down memory lane, but also for younger people, it gives them an insight into what it was like when I grew up and how fast our technology landscape has changed. Incredibly fast in the last 50 years.
Yeah.
So when I grew up, there were no video games. It's as simple as that, you know. The most important things in terms of technology and entertainment, the newest thing was the television. Mm-hmm. The television was like, I mean, people freaked out over it, you know. And I was lucky because my parents were early adopters. And we had a TV set at home from about the late 50s. So when I was about 5-6 years old, I first, you know, had my first experience with TV. And that really, I would have to say that was the biggest influence, probably, that really shaped me for the future, because it was a new medium and many adults struggled with it. There were experts out there everywhere denouncing television, saying it was the devil. The young generations would be brain damaged for the future because of their consumption of television. There was about half an hour a week for children. One program, half-hour program per week. That was it. In the early days when it started. So you have to consider that that's my background. And I'd never heard of video games, really, until I started working with computers and later on the internet. And I sort of heard about PC gaming. But I had never in my life seen a console. In fact, the term console didn't mean anything to me. I would have said it was a piece of furniture, you know. And the kind of life we lived, the environment we lived in, I just never encountered it. So my gaming experience is very, very recent. I started exactly 8 years ago. So I'm a bit unusual, I suppose, in that as an older person, when I was already just over 60, I suddenly discovered this new world and decided I wanted to get to know it better. I've always loved having new projects and new things to discover. And because I'm not very mobile anymore and I can't travel a lot or anything like that, I'm always hungry for new adventures. And this was a really big adventure for me, getting into gaming.
What I personally found interesting about like what you said is that your video games, quote unquote, was TV. And I've had several conversations with other content creators about the concept of TV, because it seems like what's happening right now, especially in the content creator space, is that a lot of people are flocking towards streaming because it's a new form of media, not understanding that history has already dictated that media can come and go and that it's just another form of communication, much like how TV was. Like TV both had pre-recorded media and live TV. Those were actual things. And to give you some context, Britta, I used to be a Twitch streamer about 5 or 6 years ago. And then when I got married to my wife, because of the rigors of streaming, there was no way that I could live a peaceful life and sacrifice time away from my wife when people are just coming on in the evening after work and all that stuff. And so I took the road less traveled, so to speak, and went to YouTube and started creating video, knowing full well that there may even be a bigger audience there that is hungry for positive kind of content. And the reason why I kind of frame it that way is because my reviews try to balance being critical and also being positive. And I know full well that when I make reviews, I have to leave my audience in a better place than when they started watching videos. Do you find that that's something that you consciously do with your videos? Because I will be honest, like when I watch your videos, it always makes me feel good and I want to watch more.
Yeah, a lot of people say that. I have to confess, I don't think about that at all before making a video or in between or whatever. I just try to be the person that I am and share what I am enthusiastic about, what I found interesting, and then later maybe have a conversation about it with people who've watched the video. Let me just briefly explain. I once tried using a script for a video, having it scripted beforehand. And my husband was doing the camera, as he quite frequently does. And I was sort of reading the script to the camera, and he looked at me like, who is this woman? I don't know her, you know. And I said, I feel like a zombie, you know, that this is not, he said it's not natural, it's not you. And yeah, I never use a script apart from having notes on, you know, dates and names and stuff like that I want to make sure I get right. So it's just straightforward me. That's all it is. And maybe that's one reason why people find it easy to connect, because it's not premeditated or I don't put up a front or anything like that. That's really all I can say. I've learned throughout my 7 decades in life that it is always better to keep something simple. Never overcomplicate anything. That's my motto in life anyway. If you can keep it simple is good. It doesn't mean it's easy or it's shallow or anything like that. The best artists you come across have a way of presenting their art, whether it's movies or a painting or, you know, sculpture, whatever, in a way that looks so easy and natural. You just think, oh, yes, of course. What you don't see is the hours and hours behind it. There was a famous painter who once said, you don't pay me for the painting that took me half an hour to paint. You pay me for the 20 years of struggle and learning I've had to be able to do that. And I always think that's how I see it, really.
Mm-hmm. That's actually Pablo Picasso. That's a story that I tell a lot of people who are starting as content creators. And the story goes that a fan approached him at a cafe in Paris and asked him to draw something on a piece of napkin. And after he'd spent a short amount of time drawing it, of course, Pablo Picasso charged him like millions of dollars or euro or pounds or what have you, or whatever, francs, I guess, because it's Paris at the time. Yeah. And of course, the fan said, like, why are you charging me so much? You just literally did this in like about 2-3 minutes. And Pablo Picasso said something along the lines of like, good sir, this took me my entire lifetime to learn, or to do, rather. It's very poetic what you said too. And I'm a firm believer of keeping things simple. You're a reader, and I actually read a book about 2 or 3 years ago during my YouTube journey called Insanely Simple. And what it was all about is this marketer's journey from being a PR person for Steve Jobs back in the early 90s all the way up when he returned to Apple, and kind of talking about how Apple imbues a lot of simplicity into their projects and also their marketing. And I don't want to kind of make this all about Apple, but the bottom line is that there is a valid concept out there called design by subtraction. And that's something that I am personally trying to master myself. And when I watched your videos, like every single time, here's a good example. I'm inundated by things to unbox lately. And so I was thinking to myself, how would Food4Dogs do unboxings? And I was actually surprised because some of your videos are pretty long for unboxing videos, all things considered. Yes. And then when, the more that I watched it, the more I understood the spirit behind them. And, with great editing and stuff, there was so much character in these unboxing videos that it truly separates it from all the other unboxing videos out there where they're just kind of, okay, well, here's a box and then boom, 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 boom.
Yeah. Yes. Unboxing is really, it's so strange that I should have landed with unboxings, because the first time I saw an unboxing on YouTube years ago, I said to my husband, look, there's somebody pulling stuff out of a box and people are watching it. I couldn't believe it. What can I say? I now spend probably at least an hour prepping and setting up for an unboxing. There are usually several hours of background research that go into it. I can't really specify it further because I often, it might take me a week or two to think about it and prepare it all. So one thing I would say, especially for aspiring content creators, is it's all in the prep. Make it look really easy and simple when you do it. But if the preparation is spot on, then it will just come across a lot better, like having stuff in the right place at the right time, But my husband is my greatest critic for unboxings. He always says, there's too much on the table and you didn't swivel it around, so I couldn't get a good shot of it. And, we try to work out beforehand a bit. I tell him, well, I'm going to do this one first, and then I'll open that box and pull stuff out, and I always do the art book. He knows that. And but of course, unboxings, you don't know what's in the box. Well, I don't, or not exactly. So there's usually some kind of surprise, and you think, oh my goodness, what's that? Or how am I going to present that? You've got to be quick on your feet as well. So I might suddenly pull something out, and my husband behind the camera going, hey, pull it back. I can't get a shot of this, So there's all sorts of funny stuff with unboxings, and we keep practicing and trying to do better and trying to hone our technique. It's quite interesting, really. You wouldn't think that so much, technical know-how or just general preparation would have to go into something as simple as opening up a box and presenting the contents. I'd have to say, in many cases, I regard games and the surrounding items as being part of artwork. It certainly is when you're looking at drawings in an art book. And many games are art. So I try to be respectful about that and always reflect that in my comments. Even if I might be slightly disappointed with an item, I don't diss it, because that's, to me, I don't do that. I always try to take into account the amount of creativity and work that somebody's put into this item that's sitting in a box. We're so used as consumers to just buy stuff and, oh, that's nice, oh, I don't need that, and throw it out, And I like to pay a bit more respect to individual items, because every little bit a lot of thought has to go into. And I can tell when someone has not put a lot of thought into just designing the box for the stuff to fit into or whatever. It all needs to fit together, I'm a bit picky like that, yeah.
Yeah. I think what I'm learning today that's very fascinating is I feel like simplicity and thoughtfulness go hand in hand, because every time I meet somebody who believes in the idea of simplicity, they're very thoughtful and careful about everything that they do. And while you described how you spend an hour recording an unboxing, there's a lot of thought put into every piece of it that, of course, your husband collaborates with you on, but also it's another opportunity that you use to learn for the future. And I gotta say, as an aside, that today I actually watched your Atelier Mysterious Trilogy unboxing, and the way that you described the crystal paperweights, at first I was like, why is Britta obsessed about these crystal paperweights? Until I got to the part where you showed it in front of the camera with the artwork that was embedded in it, and I'm like, why am I thinking of buying this now? This is crazy.
Yes, yeah, that's exactly what happened to me the first time I unboxed a Japanese edition with a crystal paperweight in it, and I hadn't even twigged at that stage, that was long ago, well into last year, that there was such a thing in the box. And when I pulled it out, I remember saying to the camera, what is this, a paperweight? I don't need a paperweight, and almost getting angry about it. And that's, of course, that's a lesson. That is a very valuable lesson, Don't judge immediately, look at what's in front of you, appreciate everything. And the moment I looked at it closely, I knew that it was special. And I just fell in love with it at that moment. And that was my journey for collecting crystal paperweights for Atelier. I quite like sharing that because it's a bit of a journey. There's a story in it. And I think stories are just invaluable. It gives people the ability to follow along on a narrative. And I think that has a power of its own.
I agree. Something that I tell some people that I talk to, and I talk to a lot of content creators of various sizes, is that if there's one thing that we can trust when we're creating anything, is that storytelling has been around since the dawn of time, and that we can always rely on imbuing our stories with emotion and even peaks and valleys in a way that can really attract or even deter some people sometimes. I don't want to keep talking about my channel, but when I write my reviews, it's actually structured like a 3-part novel or play or story, what have you. There's a beginning, middle, and an end kind of thing, where there is a rising action. And almost every single time, if there's a criticism, that's where the action drops, because people really often don't like hearing bad news. I learned this lesson when I reviewed Fist of the North Star Lost Paradise, where I kind of left my audience at a downer note, and I never really lifted their spirits back up. And I think, and while, and I'm glad that you don't have to worry about this, because that is something that's a piece of script, which kind of does make me curious, though, because we've talked about how you started your YouTube journey to some degree, and when you started playing video games. But I am kind of curious, like, what games you started with. Like, what were the formative games that kind of really got you interested in playing games?
I get that question a lot, and I find it actually quite difficult to remember because it was like a wave that just crashed over me, and a lot of the detail of the early times is a bit lost in the mists of time to me. But I do remember, so I thought that question might come up. So I've been rummaging around my games, and because I started out on the PlayStation 3, and I have been collecting for that. So fortunately, I have physical copies. And one game I played very, very early on. In fact, it must have been, I think, in the first a bundle of 3 games that my husband and I picked up at the local video rental store, because that was the only place we could think of where you might be able to get a game to try out. We still had video stores back in those days. They're almost gone now in New Zealand. Mm-hmm. And let me just get that over. I picked up, I hope you can see this on camera. Because I had to rely on the recommendation of the lady in the store. I came up, this sort of 60-something old lady, and said, I've never played a video game, but I want to try. Can you recommend something for a beginner? To her eternal credit, she didn't bat an eyelid. So she gave me several, and they were probably more suitable for children and licensed kind of games. And this, of course, is one of them. It was, when I saw the cover, I said, I'll try that, because we're huge fans of the original movie. And so I do remember this, and I only very recently decided to acquire a physical copy for nostalgic reasons. But when I popped it into my PlayStation 3 and started it up, I was immediately drawn into it because it's really beautifully presented, and for a licensed game, it's actually not that bad. So I do enjoy playing and replaying it. I obviously didn't get very far the very first time I tried because I didn't know really what a controller was and how to use it, or every step had to be painfully learned and worked out. But I do remember that I got to a certain point. I could track that when I played it again. And what took me then over an hour to get to a certain point, I can now do in 5 minutes. So that shows you how difficult it is for anyone who has never played a game before, and not in childhood, when we pick up things much more easily, of course, as children, how long it takes to actually learn the language and the conventions of gaming. So I approach most new things I learn that way, that I regard them as a new language, and you learn them. Vocabulary, grammar, structure. And but it took a long time, and I just kept at it, because once I got sucked in, there was, you know what it's like. Everybody knows what it's like. It's the most wonderful feeling in the world to be able to enter into a fantasy world and be able to live and operate in it. That's what attracts me to it. So that was one of the very early ones. And once I discovered that there was a place called PlayStation Network online, which has a shop, I was like a kid in a candy store. I spent weeks and weeks trawling around, and what I did was I made notes of all the games that looked interesting to me, and then I looked them up online, and then I just started reading and reading like mad, and just absorbing all the information, learning. Mm-hmm. And one of the early games I picked out which I bought digitally at the time, was Dragon Age. I'm a big fan of dragons, so anything with dragons in it, I will give it a go. So yeah, so Dragon Age, that was a very early introduction to RPGs, and that was lucky because once I'd experienced an RPG, it just all fell into place for me, and I thought, yeah, I'm at home there. I can stay there. That's my home. That's my genre. Yeah.
Ferelden is a very dangerous place to live, though. It's like I think about Dragon Age Origins, which, by the way, I have bought Dragon Age Origins on every platform it came out on, including the Mac, which I barely played.
Oh,
and
okay.
I really loved that world, but I definitely get what you mean, though, of living and really indulging yourself in being in these fantasy worlds, because I feel that way every time I try a game, even if it is as threatening as Ferelden. But I do want to kind of touch upon two things that you brought up during this conversation, because for one thing, repurchasing Brave in order to kind of connect with your first time being a gamer and stuff, being introduced. I can relate to that because about 5 or 6 years ago, I went to a swap meet and they had this mint condition Mike Tyson's Punch-Out for the NES. And, for people who don't know, that was actually the game that my dad and I played together when we met for the first time. I was about 10 years old, and he introduced me to a console, the Famicom at the time, and we had rented Mike Tyson's Punch-Out. And about 2 decades later, I found it mint condition, and I repurchased it to kind of honor that memory.
Yeah.
And the second part that I want to kind of touch upon that I think is very interesting is that you get the question a lot of like how you started playing video games and which one. So what I want to do right now is I want to bring in my friend who was the previous guest on the show. His name is Steven, but he's known on YouTube as Dr. Level Up. He has a message for you, and he wants to ask you a question that I'm pretty sure you've never been asked before.
Okay. Yeah.
Hey, Food4Dogs. I just wanted to tell you that whenever I watch your videos, I see someone who has the ability to inspire people, both young and old, in two really incredible areas. One, that no matter your age, no matter where you're from, you can be a content creator. And two, no matter your age, no matter who you are, you can enjoy gaming. I never thought that I would regularly watch someone who could be my grandmother, who also loves tons of JRPGs. I think it's absolutely incredible. My encouragement to you is to be yourself and embrace who you are as a content creator. Embrace the fact that you're one of the older content creators out there, and use all of that life experience to encourage and inspire other people to realize that there can be a life full of fun and games no matter what. My question for you is, what is one question that you wish other people would ask you that nobody has yet? Because everybody's asked you, what's Food4Dogs? Why do you collect stuff? But what's a question you wish someone would ask that no one has?
Wow, that is one smart question. I don't actually wish to be asked questions usually, because believe it or not, I'm an incredibly reclusive person. I'm your typical introvert. I don't socialize a lot. I don't even talk to a lot of people because I often don't enjoy it. Present company, of course, being very different. I've met, this is the thing, I've met so many people online with whom I've had the most fascinating conversations and made friends. And, where I live, the opportunities are not that easy. So being online just opens up a world to me that otherwise I wouldn't be able to access. But being a pretty private person on the whole, I hadn't really thought, I wish somebody would ask me about that. I tried to cover a lot of territory in the tech of my childhood videos so that people get an idea of my childhood and where I've come from, and that answers a fair few questions. Very few people have asked me about my education, and I'm actually really passionate about the subject that I studied at university, and I majored in social anthropology. And to me, it's just the most fascinating topic in the world, and I think people are beginning to wake up to it. When I studied it, it was still very, very traditional. Anthropologists went out to weird little islands and studied, unknown tribes. It was all entirely niche, and people thought we were just a bit strange. But nowadays it's opened up, and anthropologists can study any cultural aspect of any society in the world, and I think that's really it's opened up the way people can look at cultures. So I'm really glad about that, but that is an abiding interest I have, and I always try to introduce that particular subject matter whenever I can. Yeah. So that's really the only thing I can think of.
Mm-hmm. And thank you for answering that question as well, because that is a very interesting insight into your past that not a lot of people might not know. And also I absolutely agree with you, because, and thank you for elucidating on that, and so that everybody can understand what it is, what the definition of it is. I do think that social anthropology is very interesting, and it's one of those fields that you can, as you said, literally apply to everything. It reminds me of a study that some scientists have had. While it's not really a social anthropology study, it's a way to apply the sciences into something non-traditional. And the thing that I'm describing is the plague, quote unquote, that spread in World of Warcraft because of a bug in the game's code. It was an unintended consequence of accidentally making everybody vampires just by proximity alone, with very minimal intervention. And so scientists actually studied that to figure out how fast a pandemic can spread, which it might be a timely topic considering the circumstances, but it's an example of how you can apply all of these studies into something that might not have been present many years ago. And I absolutely agree with that sentiment that, I mean, that kind of knowledge can be applied to everything and anything.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and that's why I love it so much, whether it's World of Warcraft or for us, of course, who love JRPGs, it is often very important because there's still, in certain parts of our societies, a lack of understanding or even resentment towards Japanese culture, and just the ability to try and move towards, well, what would it be like if I lived in that society? I would grow up with those particular attitudes and perceptions. The moment people open up and see themselves not just as, this is how I've grown up, everybody else should be like this, the moment they realize that there are so many different ways of living for most people around the globe, and just open up to that diversity, the world becomes a much more fascinating place. That's the thing I'm always surprised about. Who wants to live a boring life when there's so much out there that you can experience? Yeah, yes. So anthropology all the way.
It's definitely interesting the way that you frame it too, because when I grew up, my family considers themselves as well-traveled, and something that you brought up earlier is because of your current disposition and stuff, like you want to undertake more adventures, and that video games allow you to do something like that. And that kind of reminded me of Rick Steves, who is a travel person. And one of the things that he said was that when he traveled, he learned so much more about the world that he's humbled to get to know all these different cultures, ultimately framing where his place is in the larger world as a whole. With regards to Japanese culture, I'm reminded of a quote by Yoko Taro when he started talking about the recently re-released Nier Replicant, where there was a failure to understand what the difference is between how children are perceived in the West versus a childish attitude. And he said something along the lines of, like, in Japan, the idea of being childish isn't locked to an age. You could be a childish child or a childish adult, or rather, to put it in another way, an adult who acts like a child. Whereas in the West, it's much more defined based off of your age, which is something that you touched upon again, speaking to other people who've been told that, well, now you're an adult, you can't play video games because that's a childish hobby. You know, it's very difficult to kind of disconnect from that idea based off of your geographical location. So I just wanted to bring that up because that is definitely social anthropology. That is such an interesting thing to think about. And honestly, I didn't even think we were going to talk about social anthropology today.
There you are. It's I love it when conversations can go in unexpected directions. Yes, but as you said, it's very much a Western notion that when you grow up, you put away childish things. I think that's even a quote. And so we've got a dichotomy there, sort of like black and white. You know, this is the right thing for this age, and once you're over 16 or 18, that's it. You know, it's a different life. Whereas in Japanese video games, and I now make the connection because you've just told me, we often encounter young or grown-up people who act incredibly childishly. And the first response from a Westerner would be, what's that person doing? He's grown up. He shouldn't be such a child. Well, but, you know, it's just through watching and playing the game, you're actually learning and absorbing. Oh, look, it's very different. You know, you open up your mind. And that's what I love about playing video games from all sorts of different cultural backgrounds. And I knew nothing about Japan and Japanese culture before I started gaming. So I just love playing them because every time I learn something new or a new aspect opens up. Yeah. So that explains a lot what you just said about the attitude towards what is considered childish behavior can happen at any stage of life. And to be quite frank, if you look around you and all the people you know, you'd have to admit that, yes, we in the West have a lot of people who are grown up, but often act very childishly too. Mm-hmm. We just don't, you know, we haven't perceived it as clearly as the Japanese have. Yeah. We try to pretend that doesn't happen, but of course it does happen.
Yeah. And one thing that is also interesting to me, you know, when talking about Japanese and the contrast between Japanese and Western culture is the fact that in Japan, their culture is more towards the good of the many, where sometimes the individuality gets lost because of that sacrifice. Whereas, of course, the West is more of an individualistic society. Like, what can I do to better myself? And, you know, and it is reflected by the games as well and the attitudes towards the games, which I find really fascinating.
Yeah. I would qualify your statement just a tiny bit. The focus on communality as opposed to putting the focus on individuality. I, of course, grew up in Germany, which back in those days was a very different culture. And the emphasis on communality was back then still very, very strong. And I find playing Japanese video games, I recognize an awful lot of the attitudes, the way students behave at school, the interactions with teachers, what they're expected to do, all the chores and responsibilities they have at school. That's actually very, very similar to how I was brought up. So certain societies in the West had traditionally I would say the focus on the individual wasn't quite as strong. It was always considered it shouldn't be at the expense of others. So you were always reined in as a child, no, look at this, you can't do this because other people will be affected by this, so therefore you are not allowed. So, I experienced that side a lot more, whereas the Anglo-American culture in particular is very, very strong at emphasizing the individual and individual aspiration, and that you should be allowed to pursue those. Interesting differences. And I've lived in both types of cultures, the old-fashioned Germany and in Britain and now New Zealand, which New Zealand sort of straddles between all these different cultures. So there are, like everything in life, we don't have just one side and then the other. Everything is on a spectrum. Basically, once you begin to realize that, then you realize that having a position that says, well, this is bad because end of story, that is no explanation at all. Yeah. Everything exists on a spectrum, and the same applies with this. And of course, finding the happy medium, the balance between satisfying the individual desires and aspirations with what's good for the community as a whole, that is the tricky bit. And once again, I think we can easily relate to that because we're living in the times of a great pandemic, and that topic crops up all the time, with some people feeling their individual freedom is being curtailed, and others saying, no, we got to think of the community now. These are valid topics that every community and every society has to work through on their own terms, I feel.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think, applying design by subtraction, I think we can start to do something like that even within our gaming community, just by realizing that the games that we play hold so much more than entertainment. They hold real lessons and perhaps advice on how we should live our life, and some of the philosophies that are dictated or rather suggested by them. One of the things that I keep thinking about, for example, is how impactful Persona 5 was in terms of its storytelling, not just from a entertainment standpoint, but also questioning authority and the effect of various authority figures, especially if they're the wrong ones voted into those offices, on life as a whole. And I don't know if you know this, but the reason why Persona 5 is the way that it is, and to kind of backtrack a little bit, Persona 5 actually was going to be a trip around the world where you get to learn your identity and figure that out. But when the Tohoku earthquake happened in 2011, when that nuclear disaster happened, the developers hit the brakes immediately and said, we're going to pivot this story because we're not happy with how our government is treating catastrophe, pretty much, which is how Persona 5 turned into this really darker storyline than what people are used to in the series. Yeah. There's so many kind of lessons that we can learn from games, and I think the thing that upsets me the most is that people are so focused on the criticism and being defensive about like whether somebody likes the medium or not, or what they've played, that we kind of forget the lessons that they're imparting on us. Like, be kind to others, be understanding of other people, be more empathetic towards one another. Somehow that lesson gets thrown out the door for what?
I'm always reminded of when I played my first Pokemon game. So that was fairly early on, because I got a little Nintendo 3DS, one of the early ones, soon after I got my PlayStation 3. I happened to have a really, really excellent person running my local video game outlet who actually really supported me, and he kept saying, "Britta, you would love playing on a little handheld." And I said, "What? That's a tiny. How am I going to see that tiny picture?" He said, "Try it," and he gave me a console for a week to try it out. Those were the days, yeah. and of course I became addicted to it. So and one of the first games I played was a Pokemon game, and I had heard of Pokemon, so I was intrigued, and I hadn't played for very long when I put down the console, and I was almost speechless. And I went to my husband, who has worked in the broader education sector for many decades, and I said, "Why aren't people, teachers, playing this sort of game with their students? There are so many clear lessons there for children, but presented in such an entertaining manner that kids would just scramble towards it. They'd love it." And once I showed him, he was amazed too. I consider Pokemon one of the greatest potential education tools that's probably never been used in that way. I found that as I then went on and played more and more Japanese games, that almost all of them have a very strong moral undercurrent. They all want to present and make accessible to people basic thoughts about ethics. How do I behave in a situation like this? Am I loyal to my friend, or do I carry out the instructions I was given by my teacher? Simple situations like that, but presented in a way that kids can understand them and work out there is a dilemma here. How do I resolve that? And encouraging them to adopt very simple, straightforward, but fundamental moral values, like, be honest, be loyal and supportive of your friends and your family. And it comes through in almost every game I play. And I find that fascinating. So I think there's a lot there that we can learn from Japanese games in particular. But once again, Western games have picked up those messages in their own way as well and presented them for their audiences. So I just seem to respond to Japanese games in a particular way, like I can just home in on them and just feel at home straight away, despite the very different culture where I don't understand everything. But that doesn't matter. You don't have to understand everything down to the last detail to be able to appreciate it.
I think really you've touched a lot of why you'll love JRPGs, and I want you to recognize that. And I think just by our conversation here alone, I have a very good understanding of why you gravitate towards JRPGs specifically. You mentioned about how you love, reading books and these stories and going on adventures, and how much the culture that they show through these games you can identify with very clearly. Unfortunately, we are out of time. So what I want to ask you then is that, no, it's okay. What I want to ask you then is, for people who are reluctant in trying out JRPGs, what would you want to say to them?
That's a hard one, because I don't know why they are reluctant. Most people I've talked to cite the anime aesthetic as off-putting, and I just have no way of relating to that, so I find it really, really hard. All I can probably say is to recommend they maybe watch animated Japanese movie like Spirited Away, one of the Miyazaki movies, and see if they can at all relate to that. I think it's just getting over that sort of barrier That would be my suggestion. But otherwise, it's really hard. If someone has their mind set on not liking something, in my experience, it's futile trying to, push against that. I never try to persuade people to like something in my videos because it's probably completely pointless. Unless someone is prepared to just drop their barriers about a whole variety of issues. If they're reluctant to try, they're committed gamer but reluctant to try JRPGs, which is an important genre both historically and otherwise, then I suspect they are also reluctant to try a lot of other things. New things they might have an aversion to, often coming from childhood background, what your parents maybe disliked. Kids pick up all these preconceptions very easily. So, yeah, I see it as part of a wider issue, really. But if they're stuck on the anime aesthetic, then it's the old thing in the West. Animation, cartoons, are seen as for this age group 5 to 11 or 5 to 13. After that, too childish, put it away. I bet you would come across those attitudes. So I think there might be a bit of that in it, like they can't take it quite seriously and they feel like they're not being addressed as a gamer in a serious manner by being asked to play a cartoonish game. Yeah. So they need to realize that the games that look like the cartoons from their childhood are no such thing. And many animated movies and games from Japan tackle very, very adult issues. And there's a reason why many of them nowadays are age-rated, 16 plus, 18 plus, whatever. But it's very, very hard to persuade someone to try something and like it. Friends always, they want to share their enthusiasm, and it's very hard. That person has to be prepared somewhere to just drop that barrier and just say, okay, I'll give it a go. No, no preconceptions in my mind. That's a difficult thing to do.
Yeah, I think that's eloquently said. Well, as expected, as with every episode of this podcast, we can fill another hour of more conversation with you, Britta. But before we go, I'd like you to share where people can find you in case they haven't heard of your channel, because I believe me when I say she is just as enthusiastic as she is from here that she is in all her videos. So please let us know where we can find you. My channel is on YouTube and it's called Food4Dogs, and please note that it's the figure 4 in the middle. I've had people saying, I desperately tried to find your channel and I typed in food, FOR, dogs, and I got nowhere except I was presented with a load of dog food channels. So it's the figure 4, Food4Dogs on YouTube. It's the same name on Twitter, and that's basically what I cover. Awesome. And thank you so much again for, spending the time today to get to know you and answering questions that, are really odd questions. I don't really know how to frame it because, I'm still kind of reeling from the question from our previous guest. That was quite unique. But thank you for gracefully answering these questions and spending your time to chat with us today.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much, Alex.
You're welcome. And thank you to everybody who's watching this or listening to this. Remember, if you want to watch this, and you probably should because watching this podcast is a completely different experience altogether, go to my YouTube channel at youtube.com/Backlog Battle Podcast. It's amazing. I am crazy enough to actually make a second YouTube channel, so please subscribe and post a comment if you have any questions for Britta or any of our previous guests on the show. And of course, new episodes of the podcast always come out every Wednesday at 12 a.m. Pacific time without fail. We've been doing this for the past 12 years now. I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. So until next week, we'll see you guys later, and happy gaming.